The survey markers confer it. This section now officially belongs to the HOA.
By the time I stepped into my backyard that Saturday morning, the fence my father had built with his own hands was gone. Not damaged, not leaning, not broken by a storm, gone. In its place stood a bright white vinyl fence I had never approved, never paid for, and never even been warned about. It cut straight across the back of my yard like somebody had taken a knife to my property and decided how much of it I was still allowed to own. The old garden bed my dad had planted along the fence line was torn open. The soil was scraped flat. One of the wooden chairs he used to sit in after work was lying on its side, cracked at the leg, half buried in mud. I was still standing there, barefoot on the wet grass, trying to understand what I was looking at, when Richard Caldwell came through the side gate with 2 HOA board members and a contractor behind him. Richard was the HOA president, the kind of man who wore his title like a badge. His face was already red before he reached me. One hand gripped a clipboard, the other kept stabbing toward the new fence, toward my yard, toward my chest, as if pointing hard enough could turn a lie into law. He told me the land behind that fence had always been HOA common area. He said my family had been using it without permission for years. He said the board had corrected the boundary and that I would be fined every single day if I interfered with the new fence. I remember looking past him at the fresh post holes, the tire tracks in my grass, and the orange survey flags someone had shoved into my soil. One of them had a handwritten label on it, Future Access Path. That was the first moment I realized this was not just about a fence. Richard kept talking, louder each time I asked for paperwork. He claimed everything had been approved internally. He claimed the HOA had authority. He claimed I had no right to question a community improvement project. The contractor stood behind him with his arms crossed, staring at me like I was the problem for noticing that strangers had entered my property in the middle of the night. Then Richard made the mistake that changed everything. He told me I should save my money because I would never be able to fight the HOA. I did not yell back. I did not touch the fence. I did not threaten him. I simply looked up at the small black camera mounted under my back porch roof, the one Richard apparently had not noticed in the dark. That camera had recorded everything. It had recorded the workers entering my yard at 1:47 in the morning. It had recorded them pulling out my father's fence post by post. It had recorded Richard arriving with a flashlight, walking across my grass, and pointing exactly where he wanted the new fence installed. At that moment, Richard still believed he had taken a strip of my land. What he did not know was that he had just handed me the first piece of evidence in a scheme that would end with a county survey, a code enforcement investigation, a public meeting packed with furious homeowners, and his removal as HOA president. My name is Mark Ellison, and before Richard Caldwell decided my backyard belonged to him, I was the kind of homeowner most HOAs should have loved. I paid my dues on time. I kept my grass trimmed. I brought my trash cans back from the curb the same evening. I did not park on the street, throw loud parties, argue at meetings, or send angry emails over every little neighborhood rule. I worked as an electrical systems technician at a local hospital, which meant most of my days were spent fixing problems nobody noticed unless something went wrong. When I came home, all I wanted was quiet. That house was not just a place I bought because the market was right. It had been my father's house first. He purchased it when the subdivision was still half empty, back when there were more construction cones than mailboxes, and the trees behind the lots were still thick enough to make the neighborhood feel private. After my mother passed, he spent most evenings in that backyard. He built the fence himself over 2 weekends with a post-hole digger, a level, and the kind of stubborn patience only he had. He planted 2 maple trees near the back corner, laid a little stone border around the garden, and set an old wooden chair facing the yard like it was his own private front row seat to peace. When he got sick, I started coming over after work to mow the lawn, fix loose boards, and sit with him outside. He would point toward the fence and remind me that he had set it inside the property line on purpose, because he never wanted trouble with neighbors. He kept every document in a blue plastic file box in the hall closet: the deed, the original survey, the closing papers, the fence receipt, even photos from when the posts were first set. At the time, I thought it was just my dad being overly careful. Later, that box would become the reason Richard's plan collapsed. After my father died, I bought the house from the estate instead of selling it. Financially, it was not the smartest move. Emotionally, it was the only one I could live with. That backyard still felt like him. The fence, the trees, the garden bed, even the cracked wooden chair reminded me of all the evenings when life felt heavy but manageable. For the first few years, the neighborhood stayed mostly calm. Then Richard became HOA president. At first, he seemed like an over-enthusiastic retiree with too much free time. He walked the streets with a clipboard, left notices on doors, and spoke at meetings like he was running a city council instead of a small homeowners association. Then the notices became more aggressive. People got warnings for mulch color, mailbox numbers, faded shutters, basketball hoops, trash cans visible from the wrong angle, and cars parked in driveways with tires touching the edge of the grass. Most people complained privately but stayed quiet publicly. Richard understood that silence. He fed on it. He learned which homeowners were too busy, too tired, too intimidated, or too polite to push back. I was one of those people. I thought keeping my head down would keep me out of his way. If you have ever dealt with an HOA that treats ordinary homeowners like tenants on their own land, you know exactly how small it starts. One notice, one warning, one little threat wrapped in official language. Then one day, they stop asking and start taking. I just never imagined that Richard would be bold enough to take the one part of the property my father had warned me to protect. 2 days after Richard stood in my backyard and told me to save my money, the official notice arrived in my mailbox. It was printed on HOA letterhead, signed by Richard Caldwell, and written in that cold, legal-sounding language people use when they want intimidation to look professional. According to the notice, my old fence had been located inside a community maintenance corridor for years. It claimed the HOA board had reviewed the matter, determined that my family had been occupying common area without authorization, and taken corrective action to restore the proper boundary. Corrective action. That was what they called ripping out my father's fence in the middle of the night. The notice went on to say that any attempt to remove, damage, alter, or obstruct the new vinyl fence would result in a $500 daily fine, legal action, and possible suspension of my community privileges. I read that part 3 times, standing at my kitchen counter with the paper in my hand, because I could not believe the arrogance of it. They had trespassed onto my land, destroyed part of my yard, installed a fence I never approved, and now they were threatening to punish me if I touched it. I walked outside again and saw the damage in daylight. It looked worse than it had that first morning. The garden bed was scraped down to bare dirt. The stone border my father had laid was shoved into a crooked pile near the maple tree. Tire tracks ran across the grass from the side gate to the back fence line. Orange flags marked a path through what used to be my yard, and more stakes had been added overnight. One of them had been hammered so close to my maple tree that the roots were exposed. Then I saw the small plastic sign zip-tied to the new fence. Future Greenbelt Access Improvement, authorized by the HOA board. I stood there staring at that sign while my chest went tight. Greenbelt Access. That was new. Richard had never mentioned a Greenbelt Access project before. None of the newsletters had mentioned it. None of the HOA meetings I had attended had discussed it. But somehow, in the space of one weekend, a strip of my backyard had become part of a community improvement plan. I called the management company listed at the bottom of the notice. The woman who answered sounded nervous the moment I gave my address. She told me the matter had been referred directly to the board president and that I needed to speak with Richard. When I asked for the survey, the recorded easement, or any county document showing that land was common area, She paused for several seconds and said she was not authorized to release board documents over the phone. So I emailed Richard. I kept it simple. I asked for the survey supporting the fence relocation. I asked for the meeting minutes showing board approval. I asked for the legal basis for entering my property without notice. I asked for the permit number for the new fence. His reply came less than 20 minutes later. Mark, the board has already made its determination. Continued harassment of HOA leadership will result in additional enforcement action. You have been informed of your violation. Govern yourself accordingly. That phrase stuck with me. Govern yourself accordingly. As if I were some disobedient child being warned by a principal. That Thursday, I attended the HOA meeting. I had not planned to speak, but when I walked into the clubhouse, I saw my name on the printed agenda under ongoing boundary violation. Richard had not just moved my fence. He had turned me into a public example. The room was half full. Neighbors sat in folding chairs, whispering while Richard stood at the front beside a projector screen. He wore the same HOA polo, the same forced smile, the same look of authority he always carried. When my item came up, he clicked to a color map showing the back row of homes. Behind my lot, a shaded strip had been labeled Shared Greenbelt Access. My backyard had been redrawn like a piece of paper could erase a deed. Richard told everyone that certain homeowners had expanded beyond their rightful boundaries, and that the board was taking steps to reclaim community property for the benefit of all residents. He never said my father's name. He never said he had entered my yard at night. He never said the fence he removed had stood there for more than 15 years without a single complaint. When I stood and asked where the map came from, Richard's smile tightened. "It is part of our community planning file," he said. I asked if it was recorded with the county. He looked around the room, then back at me. Not every internal planning document needs to be recorded with the county. A few people shifted in their seats. I could feel them watching me, waiting to see if I would lose my temper. Richard was waiting for that too. He wanted me angry. He wanted me loud. He wanted the room to see an emotional homeowner arguing against a calm board president with a projector and a microphone. So I asked one more question. "Can I have a copy of that map?" Richard's face changed just enough for me to notice. "No," he said. "This is board property." Then one of the board members beside him added, "You can sue if you think you have a case, but the HOA has attorneys." Most homeowners do not understand how expensive these things become. There it was, the message behind every notice, every threat, every smug little phrase. They were not saying they were right. They were saying they thought I could not afford to prove they were wrong. I left that meeting with neighbors avoiding eye contact and Richard smiling like he had already won. But by the time I reached my truck, I understood what he had really done. He had created a fake paper trail in public, hoping that once the fence was up and the neighborhood heard his version, the truth would feel too complicated to fight. What Richard did not know was that my father had taught me one thing about property lines long before any of this started. Never argue with a man holding a fake map. Go find the real one. That night, I did exactly what Richard did not expect me to do. I did nothing in public. I did not post about him online. I did not send an angry message to the neighborhood group. I did not touch the new fence, even though every time I looked out my kitchen window, it felt like a stranger had planted a flag in my father's yard. I knew Richard was waiting for me to make one emotional mistake, one damaged panel, one shouted threat, one ugly email he could forward to the board and use as proof that I was unstable. So I let the fence stand. Then I opened my laptop and started building a folder. The first file I saved was the backyard camera footage. The video was clearer than I expected. At 1:47 in the morning, headlights swept across the side of my house. A white work truck backed up near my gate with its lights off. 3 men got out, carrying tools, moving fast but trying to stay quiet. They did not knock. They did not leave paperwork. They opened my side gate and walked into my yard as if they had done it before. For almost an hour, the camera recorded them pulling out the old wooden fence. One man cut through the garden bed, another dragged the boards across the lawn, a third stacked the posts near the truck. Then, at 2:15, Richard appeared with a flashlight in his hand. He was not standing at the sidewalk. He was not observing from common property. He was inside my yard, stepping over the stones my father had placed, pointing to where he wanted the new fence line to go. I watched that clip 4 times. Not because I needed to see it again, but because I needed to stop feeling shocked and start thinking clearly. After the video, I went to the hall closet and pulled out my father's blue plastic file box. It still smelled faintly like dust and old paper. Inside were documents I had not looked at since the estate closing. The deed, the original plat, the survey from when my father bought the house, the receipt from the fence company, even though he had done most of the work himself. Photos of the backyard from different years, each one showing the same fence in the same place, long before Richard ever became HOA president. The survey mattered most. It showed the rear property line running behind the old fence, not in front of it. My father had been right. He had built the fence about a foot inside his own land, leaving a small buffer just to avoid future arguments. That meant Richard had not corrected an encroachment. He had moved the fence deeper into property that was already mine. The next morning, I drove to the county records office before work. I expected confusion. I expected old maps, slow computers, maybe a long wait. What I did not expect was how quickly the clerk found the answer. There was no recorded easement behind my lot, no dedication of land to the HOA, no transfer, no maintenance corridor, no document giving the association the right to enter my backyard or claim the strip behind my house as common area. The county plat matched my father's survey. That was the first time I felt the ground shift beneath Richard's story. I asked for certified copies of everything. The clerk printed the plat, the deed references, and the property record. I paid the fee, put the documents in a folder, and sat in my truck for a minute before leaving. Richard had stood in front of a room full of homeowners and acted like the issue was already settled. But the county, the only place where that kind of boundary actually mattered, had no records supporting him at all. Then I sent a formal records request to the HOA by certified mail. I asked for meeting minutes, board votes, contractor invoices, communications about the fence relocation, any survey used to justify the work, and any permit or approval connected to the so-called Greenbelt Access Improvement. This time I did not argue. I did not accuse. I wrote every sentence like a judge might read it later. For several days, Richard ignored me. Then something unexpected happened. A board member named Linda called from a number I did not recognize. She sounded nervous, like she had waited until she was alone. She told me the board had never properly voted to move my fence. She said Richard had presented the project as routine cleanup of common property, and when someone asked whether homeowners had been notified, he claimed I had already agreed verbally. I almost laughed when she said it, but nothing about it was funny. Linda sent me one email from the internal board thread. It was short, but it changed everything. Richard had written that once the fence was installed, I would not spend the money to fight it, and the rest of the back row owners would fall in line after seeing mine done first. I printed that email and placed it beside the camera still of Richard standing in my yard at 2:15 in the morning. For the first time since the fence went up, I was no longer looking at random HOA bullying. I was looking at a plan, a calculated plan. Richard had picked the quiet homeowner with the old fence and the dead father, and assumed I would swallow the loss because fighting would be too expensive, too stressful, and too lonely. But he had miscalculated one thing. He thought my silence meant fear. It did not. It meant I was collecting proof. The licensed surveyor arrived the following Monday morning in a gray pickup truck with county maps, metal stakes, marking paint, and equipment that looked far more serious than Richard's colored projector map. His name was Daniel Price, and he had been surveying residential property lines for almost 30 years. Before he unloaded a single tool, He stood with me at the edge of the yard and looked at the vinyl fence Richard had installed. Then he looked at the maple trees, the torn garden bed, and the orange flags marked future access path. He did not say much at first. That told me more than words could have. Daniel reviewed my deed, my father's original survey, and the certified county plat I had picked up from the records office. Then he began measuring. He set up his equipment near the rear corner of my lot, checked the recorded markers, compared them against the subdivision plat, and slowly worked his way across the backyard while I stood near the porch and watched. About 20 minutes in, Richard appeared. He must have been watching from somewhere, because he came through the side gate like a man rushing to stop a crime. His face was tight, his jaw clenched, and his clipboard was tucked under one arm like a weapon. He demanded to know what we were doing on HOA-controlled common land. Daniel did not raise his voice. He simply said he had been hired to survey my property according to the deed and the county record. Richard tried to interrupt him. He said the HOA had internal planning documents. He said the land had been designated for community use. He said the new fence represented the corrected boundary. Daniel looked at him for a moment, then went back to his equipment. That calm dismissal bothered Richard more than any argument could have. By noon, the truth was marked in bright paint and metal stakes. The new vinyl fence was not sitting on the property line. It was not even close. At the widest point, it had been placed nearly 8 feet inside my land. Across the full width of the backyard, Richard had taken more than 900 square feet and tried to relabel it as common area. Then Daniel showed me something that made the back of my neck go cold. My father's old fence had not been encroaching at all. It had been built inside our own boundary, just like he always said. For 15 years, my family had actually been using slightly less land than we legally owned. Richard had not reclaimed HOA property. He had moved on to mine. But the real twist came when Daniel compared the county plat with the map Richard had shown at the HOA meeting. The shapes did not match. The map Richard displayed was not a recorded plat, not a legal survey, not a county-approved plan, and not a document with any authority over my deed. It appeared to be an edited concept drawing from a development proposal. Someone had taken the back row of homes, shaded a strip behind them, labeled it shared greenbelt access, and treated private yards like empty space waiting to be claimed. That was when Linda's email started making sense. Richard had not moved my fence because of a misunderstanding. He had moved it because my lot was the first piece in a larger plan. If he could force one homeowner to accept the new line, he could point to my fence and pressure the next homeowner, then the next, until the entire back row looked like it had always included an access corridor. I kept digging. Through public records, I found a preliminary proposal for a clubhouse and rental event space near the edge of the subdivision. The project needed a service and pedestrian access route. Building that route legally would have required recorded easements, owner consent, county review, and probably compensation to every affected homeowner. Richard had found a cheaper way. The developer connected to the proposal employed Richard's son-in-law as a project manager. Suddenly, the whole thing came into focus. The fake urgency, the night work, the refusal to provide the map, the threats about legal costs, the public embarrassment at the HOA meeting. Richard was not just protecting community property. He was using his position as HOA president to make a private development problem disappear by quietly shifting the burden onto homeowners who trusted the board too much to question him. That afternoon, Daniel handed me the preliminary survey results and told me the final certified report would be ready within days. I remember standing in the yard after he left, looking at the new stakes lined up behind the vinyl fence. For the first time, I could physically see the lie. It was right there in the grass, measured in feet, marked in paint, impossible to talk around. Richard had spent weeks acting like power came from a title, a clipboard, and a threatening notice. But property does not move because an HOA president wants it to. A deed does not change because a man with a projector says so, and a fake map does not survive once the real survey hits the table. When the final survey report came in, I did not send it to Richard first. I sent it to a real estate attorney. Her name was Karen Whitmore, and she spent the first 10 minutes of our meeting reading in silence. She looked at the deed, the county plat, the camera screenshots, Linda's email, Richard's notice, the contractor invoice Linda had forwarded later, and the certified survey showing the new fence sitting deep inside my property. Then she leaned back and told me Richard had made the kind of mistake arrogant people make when they confuse pressure with authority. 2 days later, her demand letter went out by certified mail to the HOA, Richard personally, the management company, the fence contractor, and the developer connected to the clubhouse proposal. The letter demanded immediate removal of the vinyl fence, restoration of my property line, reimbursement for the survey, repair of the damaged yard, preservation of all emails and board communications, and written confirmation that no one from the HOA or its contractors would enter my land again without permission. That was when the tone changed. For weeks, Richard had answered me with threats and condescension. After the attorney's letter, he stopped emailing me directly. The management company suddenly became very polite. The contractor, who had crossed his arms in my yard like I was wasting his time, called my attorney's office and claimed he had only followed written instructions from the HOA president. Code enforcement came out the following Thursday. The inspector walked the fence line with the survey in hand, took photographs, checked the setback, and asked for the permit number. There was none. The fence had been installed without proper approval, on land the HOA did not own, for a project the county had never reviewed. The county survey office confirmed Daniel's findings matched the official records. There was no maintenance corridor behind my lot, no recorded easement, no greenbelt dedication, no legal basis for the HOA's claim. A sheriff's deputy was present the day the contractor came back to inspect what he would have to remove. Nobody was arrested. Nobody needed to be. The deputy simply made it clear that if anyone crossed onto my property again without authorization, the issue would no longer be treated like a neighborhood disagreement. But the most satisfying moment happened at the emergency HOA meeting. This time, Richard was not standing comfortably at the front with his projector and fake map. He sat behind the table with pale skin and a water bottle he barely touched. The room was packed. Homeowners from the entire back row had shown up, and several of them had already noticed orange flags near their own yards. I sat beside Karen while she laid out the documents one by one. Camera footage showing workers entering my yard at 1:47 in the morning. The old survey showing my father's fence inside the legal boundary. The new certified survey showing the vinyl fence nearly 8 feet over the line. The county confirmation that no easement existed. The email where Richard said I would not spend the money to fight it. The development proposal tied to his son-in-law's company. Nobody had to shout. That was the power of it. For once, Richard could not wave a clipboard, raise his voice, or hide behind words like community improvement. Every claim he had made was sitting on the table beside a document proving the opposite. Then Linda stood up and told the room the board had never taken a valid vote to move my fence. That was when the room turned on him. The same neighbors who had avoided my eyes weeks earlier began asking about their own property lines, their own backyards, and whether Richard had used HOA money to benefit a developer. The questions came faster than he could dodge them. His face went red again, but this time it was not anger that filled the room. It was panic. Richard had spent months making homeowners feel alone. Now the entire neighborhood was watching him become the one person with no place left to hide. The first thing Richard lost was the room, not his title, not his position, not yet. He lost the room the moment homeowners realized his plan had not been about protecting the neighborhood at all. It had been about control, convenience, and a private development deal dressed up as community improvement. People who had stayed quiet for years started asking for records. They wanted meeting minutes. They wanted invoices. They wanted to know why HOA money had been used to move a fence on private land without a legal vote, a permit, or a recorded easement. Within a week, Richard was asked to step aside while the board reviewed the matter. Within a month, he was voted out completely. The vinyl fence came down under the supervision of the county inspector. The contractor who had once looked at me like I was powerless now worked silently while a deputy sat nearby in his patrol car. The posts were pulled out one by one. The panels were stacked and hauled away. Then Daniel, the surveyor, returned and marked the real property line with permanent stakes. For the first time in weeks, I could see my backyard again. The HOA's insurance carrier became involved after my attorney filed the claim. The association reimbursed my survey costs, part of my legal fees, the damaged garden bed, the broken chair, and the landscaping needed to repair the tire tracks and exposed tree roots. The contractor was fined for installing the fence without the proper permit and for performing work on private property without authorization. The clubhouse proposal quietly disappeared after residents demanded every contract, every email, and every conflict of interest be disclosed. Richard never apologized to me. At the next annual meeting, he sat in the back row instead of at the board table. He did not bring a clipboard, he did not speak. He looked smaller somehow, not because anyone had shouted him down, but because the authority he had built around himself had finally been measured against facts. That spring, I rebuilt a short section of wooden fence close to where my father's original one had stood. I did not make it taller. I did not make it dramatic. I just made sure it was exactly where the survey said it belonged. Then I replanted the garden bed beside the maple trees. Sometimes people think winning means destroying the person who tried to hurt you. But for me, winning was quieter than that. It was standing in my own yard without asking permission. It was knowing my father had been right to keep every document. It was watching a fake map lose to a real deed. Richard thought he could take land because he had a title. He thought silence meant weakness. He thought an ordinary homeowner would be too tired, too scared, or too broke to fight back. But I did not win by yelling louder than him. I won because I kept the footage, read the deed, hired the surveyor, followed the process, and refused to let someone else redraw the boundaries of my life. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or anyone who tried to make you feel powerless on your own property, share your thoughts in the comments. Someone else may need to hear this before they believe a threatening notice more than their own legal rights. Like the story, share it with someone who owns a home, and subscribe for more stories where ordinary people protect what belongs to them the right way.